In the autumn of 1985, a hunter walked through the woods of Allenstown, New Hampshire. He was following a path he had traced many times before. The land belonged to Bear Brook State Park, a stretch of forest that covered more than 10,000 acres in the southern part of the state. The trees were beginning to lose their leaves. The light that filtered through the canopy had taken on the pale golden quality of late October. The air carried the first hints of winter, that crisp edge that settles over New England as the season turns. The hunter was looking for deer, or perhaps simply enjoying the solitude that the park offered. He had been coming to these woods for years, knew the trails and clearings as well as he knew his own backyard. He did not expect to find anything unusual. He did not expect to find the barrel. It was a 55-gallon steel drum, the kind used for storing oil or industrial chemicals, the kind that could be found behind gas stations and factories throughout the region. It sat in a small clearing, partially obscured by brush that had grown up around it over the course of what appeared to be many seasons. Vines had crept up its sides. Fallen leaves had accumulated around its base in layers that suggested years of neglect. The lid was rusted but intact, sealed in a way that suggested it had not been opened in a very long time. The hunter approached it with the casual curiosity that most people would bring to such a discovery, perhaps expecting to find nothing more than old motor oil or discarded refuse from some long-ago construction project. When he pried open that lid, he found something else entirely. He found the beginning of a mystery that would take more than 3 decades to solve. Inside the barrel were human remains. They belonged to 2 individuals, and both appeared to have been there for years. The smell that emerged when the lid came off confirmed what the hunter could already see. These were not recent deaths. These bodies had been hidden here for a long time, left to decay in secret, while the world continued on around them, oblivious to what lay in the clearing just off the trail. The discovery in Bear Brook State Park would eventually become one of the most complex and haunting missing persons cases in American history. It would require the development of entirely new forensic technologies that did not exist in 1985. It would demand the dedication of investigators who refused to let the case go cold, even when every lead seemed to end in frustration and every promising avenue turned into a dead end. It would ultimately reveal not just a single tragedy, but a pattern of deception and violence that stretched across the country and spanned decades. The answers, when they finally came, would change the way law enforcement approached cold cases forever. But in October of 1985, there was only the barrel, the remains, and the beginning of a mystery that would consume investigators for generations to come. There was only the quiet of the New Hampshire woods and the terrible discovery that shattered that quiet. There was only the beginning of a wait that would last for more than 30 years. The New Hampshire State Police responded to the scene within hours of the discovery. Officers cordoned off the clearing with yellow tape that seemed impossibly bright against the muted browns and oranges of the autumn forest. The contrast was stark. The artificial marking of a crime scene against the natural beauty of the changing leaves. The intrusion of human violence into a place that had seemed peaceful and remote. The barrel was photographed from every angle, its position documented with the meticulous precision that homicide investigations require. Evidence technicians searched the surrounding area for anything that might have been left behind by whoever had placed the barrel there. But the years had erased whatever traces might once have been present. Then the barrel was carefully transported to the state medical examiner's office in Concord, where forensic specialists would begin the painstaking work of examining its contents. The initial examination revealed that the remains belonged to 2 females. One appeared to be an adult woman estimated to be between 23 and 33 years old, at the time of her death. Her height was approximately 5 feet 4 inches. She had brown hair. Beyond these basic physical characteristics, there was little that could immediately identify her. No identifying marks, no tattoos, no surgical scars, or healed fractures that might have been documented in a medical record somewhere. She was simply a woman unknown and anonymous, whose life had ended violently and whose body had been hidden away from the world that had once known her. The other victim was a young girl, somewhere between 5 and 11 years old. A child who should have been in school, who should have been playing with friends and learning about the world, who should have had decades of life ahead of her. She was small, as all children are small, and her remains told the same story of violence and concealment that the adult woman's did. Both had been wrapped in plastic bags before being placed in the barrel, a detail that spoke to a level of planning and deliberation that investigators found deeply unsettling. This had not been a crime of passion, a sudden explosion of violence that had overwhelmed someone before they could think. This had been calculated, methodical, careful. Both victims had been dead for what forensic experts estimated to be anywhere from 1 to 4 years. The range was frustratingly broad, but the science of the time could not narrow it further. Decomposition is a complex process, affected by temperature, humidity, the presence or absence of insects, and dozens of other variables. The barrel had created a microenvironment that had both preserved some evidence and complicated the analysis. The best that investigators could say with confidence was that these deaths had occurred sometime in the early 1980 seconds, probably between 1981 and 1984. The cause of death for both individuals was determined to be homicide. The adult woman had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, injuries that were consistent with a violent attack, the kind of injuries that are caused by something hard and heavy striking the skull with force. The child showed similar injuries. Someone had killed them both, then taken the time to wrap their bodies, place them in the barrel, seal it, and transport it to this remote location in the woods. Someone had driven to Bear Brook State Park with the barrel in their vehicle, had carried or rolled it into the clearing, and had left it there, presumably expecting that it would never be found. The manner of their deaths and the care taken to conceal their bodies suggested that whoever had done this had not acted impulsively. This was the work of someone who had planned, who had thought about how to hide what they had done, who had chosen this remote location in the woods of New Hampshire as a place where the victims might never be discovered. It was the work of someone who knew how to dispose of bodies, who perhaps had done this before or would do it again. The challenge facing investigators in 1985 was one that would define the case for years to come, a challenge that seemed almost insurmountable given the circumstances of the discovery. They had 2 victims, but they had no idea who those victims were. In most homicide cases, identification is straightforward. The victim is found in a place that connects them to their identity, in their home, at their workplace, in a neighborhood where they were known. There are documents, nearby witnesses who recognize them, family members who report them missing. The investigation can begin immediately, focused on the question of who killed this known person and why. But the victims in the barrel came with none of that context. There were no identification documents in the barrel, no wallet, no purse, no personal effects that could provide a clue to the names or backgrounds of the deceased. The woman wore no jewelry except for a simple ring that could have been purchased anywhere, that bore no inscription or distinguishing characteristics. The child had nothing with her that could connect her to a family, a school, or a community that might be missing her. They existed in the present only as bodies, as victims, as cases to be solved. Everything about who they had been before their deaths remained hidden in the past. Investigators began the painstaking work of trying to identify the victims through other means. They examined missing persons reports from New Hampshire and the surrounding states, looking for any mother and daughter who had disappeared together during the early 1980 seconds. The reports were numerous, reflecting the sad reality that people go missing all the time in America, that families lose track of each other for reasons both innocent and tragic, that the systems designed to keep track of citizens are far from perfect. But none of the reports seemed to match the victims in the barrel. The descriptions did not align. The circumstances did not fit. The women and children who had been reported missing were either accounted for elsewhere or did not match the physical profile of the victims. They compared the forensic profile of the woman to known missing persons cases, hoping that age, height, dental records, or other distinguishing features might produce a match. Dental records were particularly valuable in this era before DNA analysis became routine. Teeth are durable, resistant to decomposition, and often unique enough to confirm an identification when other methods fail. But comparing dental records requires having something to compare against, requires knowing whose records to request. Without a name, without even a likely name, to investigate the dental records of the victim in the barrel remained an answer without a question. They reached out to law enforcement agencies across New England and beyond, asking if anyone had an open case that might correspond to what had been found in Bear Brook State Park. They sent descriptions to national databases, hoping that somewhere a family was looking for a woman and child who had vanished. They followed up on tips that came in from the public, checking out reports of missing persons who might fit the profile, investigating leads that mostly went nowhere. The searches came up empty. No one seemed to be looking for a woman and a child who matched the descriptions of the victims. No family came forward to claim the remains. No community reported a mother and daughter who had vanished without explanation. It was as though the two individuals in the barrel had existed outside of society entirely, belonging to no one and missed by no one. This absence was itself a kind of tragedy, suggesting lives that had been isolated or marginalized, lives that had slipped through the cracks of a society that should have noticed when they disappeared. Perhaps they had been estranged from their families. Perhaps they had been living on the margins, moving from place to place, never establishing the kind of roots that would make their absence noticed. Perhaps the people who had known them had assumed they had simply moved on, had started a new life somewhere else, and had not realized that something terrible had happened. Anyone who has worked in law enforcement knows that cases without identified victims present particular challenges. The usual investigative tools become useless when the victim remains unknown. Detectives are left searching for leads without any clear starting point, casting a wide net and hoping that some piece of information might eventually emerge from the vast uncertainty surrounding the case. They are looking for a connection that may not exist, for a clue that may never surface, for a break that may never come. In Allenstown in 1985, detectives cast that net as widely as they could. They interviewed residents of the area, asking if anyone remembered anything unusual in the years leading up to the discovery. Had anyone seen strangers in the park, carrying something heavy? Had anyone noticed vehicles parked in remote areas where people did not usually park? Had anyone heard rumors or stories that might be relevant? Had anyone in the community suddenly disappeared around the same time the victims were estimated to have died? The interviews produced little of value. The park was large and largely unmonitored. People came and went without anyone keeping track. Hikers, hunters, fishermen all moved through the park at various times without registering with anyone. The person who had left the barrel in the woods had done so without attracting notice, had blended into the ordinary traffic of the park, and then vanished, taking their secret with them. They examined the barrel itself more closely, looking for manufacturer's marks or other identifying features that might indicate where it had come from. The barrel was of a common type, widely available, and used for various industrial purposes throughout the region. It could have come from anywhere, from any of hundreds of factories, gas stations, or industrial facilities that used such containers. There was nothing distinctive about it, nothing that could narrow down its origin. As months passed without progress, the case began to cool. It was not that investigators stopped caring or stopped working. It was simply that there were no new leads to pursue, no fresh information to examine, no paths forward that had not already been explored and found wanting. The remains of the woman and child were kept in the custody of the medical examiner's office, waiting for the day when someone might finally claim them, might finally give them names. The files on the case were kept open, reviewed periodically for any new developments. But the active investigation gradually wound down as other cases demanded attention and resources. The town of Allenstown moved on as towns always do. The seasons turned, the years accumulated, and the memory of what had been found in Bear Brook State Park receded from the front pages and the daily conversations of the community. Halloween came and went. The following spring brought new growth to the woods where the barrel had been found. New leaves covering the clearing where the crime scene tape had once marked a place of death. The following autumn brought new hunters into the park, most of them unaware of what had been discovered the year before. But the memory did not disappear entirely. There were people in the community who thought about the woman and the child in the barrel, who wondered who they had been and what had happened to them. There were investigators who returned to the case periodically, reviewing old evidence and searching for anything that might have been missed. There were detectives who kept the file on their desks, even as other cases piled up, unwilling to completely let go of a mystery that had touched something deep in their professional consciences. The victims deserved answers. The victims deserved names. The victims deserved justice. And until those things could be provided, the case would remain unfinished. Some people find themselves drawn to cases like this. Cases where the fundamental questions remain unanswered. There is something about the unknown that captures the imagination, that refuses to let go even when logic suggests that hope is unreasonable. Who were these victims? What had their lives been like before they ended up in that barrel? Who had loved them? Who had missed them? The questions persist because the answers matter. Because every victim deserves to be known. Because the silence that surrounds an unidentified body is itself a kind of injustice that demands to be addressed. 15 years passed. The world changed in ways large and small. The Cold War ended. The internet emerged and began to transform communication and commerce. New technologies appeared that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators who had worked the original case. New investigative techniques were developed, and the very nature of criminal investigation was transformed by advances in DNA analysis and computer databases. Cold case units became more common in police departments across the country, as law enforcement recognized that unsolved crimes deserved ongoing attention even as new cases demanded resources. The case in Allenstown remained open, but it had long since stopped being an active investigation in any meaningful sense. It was one of those cases that detectives hoped might someday be solved, but had little reason to believe would produce answers in the foreseeable future. The victims remained unidentified. The perpetrator remained unknown. The barrel had revealed nothing that could point toward a solution. The case waited, as cold cases always wait for the break that seemed unlikely to come. Then, in the year 2000, the case changed completely. The transformation came not from new evidence found in New Hampshire, but from events unfolding thousands of miles away in California. A man named Larry Vanner had moved to Allenstown sometime in the mid-1980s. He had arrived with a young girl he claimed was his daughter, and he had lived in the area for several years before eventually moving away. He was remembered by some who had known him as a quiet man, perhaps a bit odd, who had kept largely to himself. He had worked various jobs in the area, nothing particularly notable or memorable. He had been a face in the community, but not a prominent one. The kind of person who passes through a place without leaving much of an impression. He had eventually relocated to California, where he had remarried and started what appeared to be a new life under a new name. In 2000, a man going by the name Bob Evans was arrested in California on charges that initially appeared unrelated to what had been found in New Hampshire. The charges stemmed from a domestic situation involving his wife, and as part of the investigation, California authorities began looking into the background of the man they knew as Bob Evans. What they found was deeply troubling. Bob Evans did not appear to have existed before a certain point in time. His history was filled with gaps and inconsistencies that could not be explained by normal circumstances. The identity he had been using appeared to be fraudulent, borrowed from a dead child whose name he had stolen. Further investigation revealed that Bob Evans had previously gone by the name Larry Vanner. And Larry Vanner, as it turned out, had been living in Allenstown, New Hampshire, at approximately the same time that two bodies had been placed in a barrel in Bear Brook State Park. The connection was circumstantial, but it was enough to reopen the investigation. When investigators returned to Bear Brook State Park in November of 2000, they were not expecting to find anything new. 15 years had passed since the original discovery. The woods had changed, grown over, reclaimed whatever traces might have been left by the perpetrator. They were conducting a routine search of the area, driven by the revelation that a man who had lived in the vicinity was now under investigation for possible identity fraud and other crimes. The connection to the 1985 case was tenuous at best. There was no direct evidence linking Larry Vanner to the barrel or to the remains that had been found inside it. But investigators had learned over the years that cold cases sometimes yielded their secrets in unexpected ways. Persistence was often rewarded in ways that could not be predicted. They decided to conduct another search of the area, just in case anything had been missed the first time around. They walked through the woods, examining the ground and the underbrush, looking for anything that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation 15 years earlier. They swept an area larger than the original search, pushing deeper into the forest, checking locations that had been deemed too remote to be relevant in 1985. What they found stunned everyone involved in the case. It was a discovery that would redefine everything they thought they knew about what had happened in these woods. Less than 100 yards from the location where the first barrel had been discovered, there was a second barrel. It had been sitting there undiscovered for at least 15 years. The second barrel had been concealed in the underbrush, partially buried under fallen leaves and forest debris that had accumulated over more than a decade. Like the first, it was a 55-gallon steel drum that had been partially concealed by vegetation that had grown up around it over time. Like the first, its lid was sealed. Like the first, it contained human remains. Inside the second barrel were the bodies of two more children. Both were young girls, far younger than the child who had been found in the first barrel. One appeared to be between 2 and 4 years old at the time of death, barely more than a toddler who had just learned to walk and talk, who had just begun to explore the world with the wonder that young children bring to everything. The other appeared to be between 1 and 3 years old, an infant, really someone who had experienced only the briefest glimpse of life before being taken from it. Both had been dead for an extended period, possibly as long as the victims in the first barrel. Both had been killed. Both had been hidden in the same stretch of woods as the other victims by what appeared to be the same hand. The discovery of the second barrel transformed the Bear Brook case from an unsolved double homicide into something far more disturbing. 4 victims, all female, had been placed in barrels in the same stretch of woods. The manner of their deaths, the method of their disposal, and the proximity of the 2 dump sites all pointed toward a single perpetrator. Someone had killed these 4 individuals, possibly over a period of years, and had chosen Bear Brook State Park as the place to hide their bodies. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. This was the work of a serial killer. The question of identity, which had defined the case since 1985, now became even more urgent. Who were these 4 victims? How were they connected to each other? Were they members of the same family as the presence of young children alongside an adult woman seemed to suggest? And how were they connected to the man who had been living in the area? The investigation that followed the discovery of the second barrel was one of the most intensive cold case efforts in New Hampshire history. Every available resource was directed toward solving what had become a quadruple homicide. The stakes were no longer just about solving an old crime. There was now a clear pattern, a clear suggestion that whoever had done this might have done it before and might do it again if not identified and stopped. Investigators pulled every available record related to Larry Vanner, tracing his movements and activities during his time in Allenstown. They examined employment records, rental agreements, utility bills, any document that might establish where he had been and what he had been doing during the relevant time period. They interviewed people who had known him, trying to piece together a picture of his life and the relationships he had maintained during the years he lived in the area. They gathered photographs, compared handwriting samples, built a comprehensive file on a man who had worked very hard to avoid leaving any trace of his true self. What emerged from this investigation was a portrait of a man who seemed to exist at the center of a web of deception so vast that untangling it would take years of patient work. Larry Vanner, as he had called himself in New Hampshire, had used multiple identities throughout his life. He had moved from place to place, establishing himself in communities for a few years before moving on under different circumstances and different names. He had been married multiple times to different women, some under his real identity and some under assumed names. He had lived with women and children who had subsequently disappeared from his life without explanation, vanishing in ways that left no trace and prompted no investigation. The girl who had been living with Larry Vanner in Allenstown, the one he had claimed was his daughter, was of particular interest to investigators. She had been present during the time when the bodies were most likely placed in the barrels. She had lived with the man who was now suspected of committing the murders, and she had no clear identity of her own, no documentation that could establish who she was or where she had come from. Her birth certificate appeared to be fraudulent. Her background could not be traced. She existed only as the daughter of Larry Vanner, a man who himself did not exist. This girl, who had been known by various names throughout her childhood, would eventually become a key figure in the investigation. But in 2000, she was an adult, living somewhere in America under yet another identity. and investigators were still years away from finding her. They did not even know for certain that she was still alive. The man known as Larry Vanner, and later as Bob Evans, was by this time in custody in California. He was serving time for crimes committed there, and he was not cooperative with investigators who wanted to question him about what had happened in New Hampshire. He denied any connection to the bodies in Bear Brook State Park. He denied knowing anything about the victims. He maintained his innocence with the same confidence and conviction with which he had maintained his false identities for decades. He was a practiced liar, someone who had spent his entire adult life deceiving others, and he was not about to confess to crimes that could not be definitively proven against him. The science of DNA analysis had advanced considerably since 1985, and by the early 2000s, investigators had tools available to them that would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who had worked the original case. DNA profiles could now be extracted from remains that had been in the ground for decades, even when those remains were in advanced states of decomposition. Those profiles could be compared against databases containing the genetic information of known individuals and their relatives. Connections that would have been invisible to earlier generations of investigators could now be established through the power of genetic science. Investigators in New Hampshire began the process of extracting DNA from the remains of the 4 victims. The work was painstaking and technically challenging. The bodies had been in the barrels for years, possibly decades, exposed to the elements and the processes of decomposition that occur even in sealed containers. The genetic material had degraded over time, making extraction and analysis difficult. But the forensic scientists persevered, applying techniques that were at the cutting edge of the field, and eventually they were able to develop genetic profiles for each of the 4 victims. The profiles confirmed what investigators had suspected from the beginning. The adult woman and one of the children from the first barrel were biologically related. The genetic markers were clear and unambiguous. The woman was almost certainly the mother of the girl who had been found with her. The 2 children in the second barrel were also related to each other, sharing genetic markers that indicated a sibling relationship, and they were related to the woman as well, showing the same pattern of shared DNA. All 4 victims appeared to be members of the same family, a mother and her 3 daughters. This finding was both a breakthrough and a deepening of the mystery. The victims were connected by blood, which meant that identifying any one of them would likely lead to the identification of all 4. But despite this new information, investigators were still unable to match the DNA profiles to any known missing persons. There was no record of a mother and 3 daughters who had vanished together during the relevant time period. The family in the barrels remained anonymous, their names lost somewhere in the gap between their deaths and their discovery. The man at the center of the investigation, meanwhile, continued to elude easy identification. Larry Vanner had been a false identity, a name borrowed from someone who had no idea it was being used. Bob Evans had been a false identity as well, taken from a man who had died as a child and whose death record had been exploited to create a fake paper trail. Investigators suspected that the man had used other names throughout his life, slipping from one identity to another as circumstances required, leaving behind each persona when it became inconvenient or dangerous to maintain. They traced his movements across the country, finding evidence that he had lived in multiple states under various aliases. In each place, he had established himself as a normal member of the community. He had held jobs, maintained relationships, and appeared to be an ordinary person living an ordinary life. But beneath that ordinary exterior was something much darker, a pattern of behavior that became more disturbing the more investigators learned. They found that he had been involved with multiple women over the years, some of whom had subsequently disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. The women who had been in his life tended to be vulnerable in some way, isolated from their families, struggling with personal problems, or otherwise lacking the support systems that might have protected them from a predator like him. He had a gift for identifying such women and for ingratiating himself into their lives. He was charming when he wanted to be, attentive and supportive in ways that made the women trust him. And then at some point, things would change. One of those women was particularly significant to the investigation. In the late 1970s or early 1980s, a woman in New England had been involved with a man who matched the description of the suspect. She had subsequently gone missing, and her disappearance had never been adequately explained. The timeline of her disappearance coincided roughly with the estimated time of death of the woman found in the first barrel at Bear Brook. Investigators began to suspect that the adult victim might be this missing woman. If true, it would mean that the killer had been living with her and her children in various locations, had traveled with them, had presented himself as a family man, all while planning or carrying out their murders. It would mean that he had killed not just strangers, but people who trusted him, who lived with him, who may have even loved him. But suspicion was not proof, and the investigation still lacked the concrete evidence needed to establish the identities of the victims beyond a reasonable doubt. The DNA profiles did not match anything in the existing databases. The circumstantial connections, while suggestive, were not sufficient to close the case. Years would pass before the final pieces of the puzzle would fall into place. The years continued to pass, and the case remained officially unsolved. The man who had been known as Larry Vanner and Bob Evans was convicted of the murder of another woman in California, Eunsoon Jun, whose body had been found in a barrel in a storage facility. The similarities between her death and the deaths of the women in New Hampshire were impossible to ignore. She had been killed, wrapped in plastic, and hidden in a barrel just like the victims in Bear Brook State Park. She had been involved with the same man under yet another identity. She had trusted him, and he had killed her. The conviction for Eunsoon Jun's murder should have brought some measure of justice. Even if the Bear Brook case remained officially unsolved, a killer had been caught, tried, and convicted. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. But the full truth about the man's crimes was still hidden, and he showed no intention of revealing it. He maintained his silence about the victims in New Hampshire. He refused to provide any information about his true identity. He refused to explain what he had done or why. Terry Peter Rasmussen, which was his real name. He had been suffering from cancer, and he died without ever facing trial for the Bear Brook murders. He was 67 years old. He had spent his entire adult life using false identities, exploiting vulnerable women, and killing those who became inconvenient or who knew too much about who he really was. He had fathered children with some of his victims, and he had raised other victims' children as his own. He had created a web of deception so complex that untangling it would take investigators years of work even after his death. With his death, the possibility of a confession disappeared forever. There would be no trial for the Bear Brook murders. No conviction, no formal acknowledgement of what he had done to the women and children in New Hampshire. The case might have been closed at that point, filed away as one of those tragedies that would never be fully resolved. The man who had committed the crimes was dead. The victims remained unidentified. There was no one left to prosecute, no justice left to pursue in the traditional sense. But the investigators in New Hampshire refused to give up. The case might be over in the sense that the perpetrator could never be brought to trial, but it was not over in the sense that mattered most. The victims still did not have their names. The families of those victims, whoever they might be, still did not know what had happened to their loved ones. Somewhere in America, there were people who had lost a mother, a sister, a daughter, and who had never learned the truth about her fate. Those people deserved answers. The victims deserved to be remembered as individuals, as human beings, not simply as case numbers in a police file. The breakthrough that everyone had been waiting for came in 2017, more than 30 years after the first barrel was discovered in Bear Brook State Park. A new field of forensic science had emerged in the years since the original investigation began. It was called investigative genetic genealogy, and it represented a revolutionary approach to identifying unknown victims and suspects. The technique combined traditional DNA analysis with the vast databases of genetic information that had been created by commercial ancestry testing services. Millions of people around the world had submitted their DNA to companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, hoping to learn more about their family histories and genetic backgrounds. These people were looking for connections to distant cousins, for information about their ethnic heritage, for answers to questions about their origins. They had no idea that their genetic information might help solve crimes that had happened before some of them were even born. The Bear Brook case was one of the first to benefit from this new technology. One of the pioneering cases that demonstrated the power of investigative genetic genealogy to solve mysteries that had seemed unsolvable for decades. Investigators submitted the DNA profiles of the victims to a genetic genealogy database and began the process of searching for relatives. The search was not for close relatives, the parents or siblings who might have already been looking for the victims, but for distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, whose connection to the victims was separated by generations. By identifying enough of these distant relatives and mapping their family trees, investigators hoped to find the point where all the trees converged, the ancestor from whom all the relatives were descended. That ancestor might lead them to the identity of the victims. What they found was remarkable, a testament to the power of genetics and genealogy to pierce the veil of decades of mystery. The genetic genealogy analysis identified distant relatives of the adult victim. These relatives had submitted their DNA to ancestry services for their own personal reasons, never imagining that their genetic information might help solve a decades-old murder case. They were scattered across the country, living their own lives, connected to the victim only by strands of shared DNA that stretched back generations. By tracing the family trees of these distant relatives, by building a comprehensive map of their ancestry, investigators were able to narrow down the identity of the woman to a specific family line in New England. Her name, they determined, was Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. She had been born in Connecticut in 1954, a year when Eisenhower was president, and rock and roll was just beginning to reshape American culture. She had grown up in New England, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had fallen in love, had children, struggled with the challenges that many young mothers face. She had made choices, some good and some bad, that had led her down a path she never could have anticipated. And at some point in the early 1982, she had become involved with a man who would take everything from her. The confirmation of Marlise's identity opened the door to identifying the children who had been found with her. The two older children in the barrels were Marlise's daughters, born during her previous relationships. One was named Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, and she had been born in 1971. She would have been around 10 or 11 years old when she died, old enough to have memories and dreams, and hopes for her future. Old enough to understand that something was wrong. The other was named Sarah Lynn McWaters, and she had been born in 1977. She would have been around 4 or 5 years old. Still young enough to believe in magic and wonder. Still young enough to trust the adults in her life to keep her safe. The identity of the youngest victim, the smallest child found in the second barrel, proved more difficult to establish. She was not one of Marlise's known children, not one of the daughters whose births had been recorded and whose existence had been documented in the usual ways. Genetic analysis suggested that she was related to the other victims, sharing DNA markers that indicated a family connection. She appeared to be another daughter of Marlise, but one who had been born without any official record. Perhaps she had been born after Marlise became involved with the man who would kill them all. Perhaps she had been born in circumstances that prevented proper documentation. Her name, whatever it had been, was never formally recorded. She had existed outside the systems that might have noted her birth, and she had died without anyone knowing who she was. For the purposes of the investigation, this youngest victim was given the name Baby Doe. She remains the least known of the 4 victims. A child who lived for only a few years before her life was taken, whose identity may never be fully established. She is a reminder that some mysteries resist solution even when most of the answers have been found. The identification of the victims was a monumental achievement, the culmination of more than 3 decades of investigative work and the application of cutting-edge forensic science. For the first time since the bodies had been discovered, the woman and children in the barrels had names. They were no longer anonymous victims, no longer just case numbers in a police file. They were Marlise Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, Sarah McWaters, and a baby girl whose identity remained partly hidden, but who was now known to be part of this family. They were real people who had lived real lives before those lives were taken from them. The identification of the victims also allowed investigators to piece together the final years of their lives, to understand how they had come to be in those barrels in the woods of New Hampshire. Marlise had met the man who would become known as Larry Vanner sometime in the late 1972. The circumstances of their meeting are not entirely clear, but what followed was a relationship that would have tragic consequences. He became a part of her life and the lives of her daughters. He presented himself as a partner, as a father figure, as someone who could be trusted. He was good at that kind of deception. He had practiced it many times before. At some point, Marlise had given birth to another daughter, the child who would be known as Baby Doe. And at some point after that, all 4 of them had been killed. The exact circumstances of their deaths, the final moments of their lives, are known only to the man who killed them. And he took that knowledge to his grave. What is known is that they died violently, that their bodies were placed in barrels, and that those barrels were left in the woods of Bear Brook State Park to be hidden and forgotten. The man responsible for their deaths was also identified through genetic genealogy, the same technology that had given the victims their names. His real name, the one he had been born with, was Terry Petter Rasmussen. Rasmussen had been born in 1943 inches, Arizona, during the last years of World War II. He had grown up in the western United States, and from an early age, he had shown signs of the deceptive and manipulative behavior that would characterize his entire adult life. He had a gift for reinventing himself, for creating new identities and new histories whenever the old ones became inconvenient. He had married multiple times, often under assumed names. He had fathered children with multiple women, and he had left a trail of destruction across the country that investigators were only beginning to understand when he died in 2010. Rasmussen had used at least 7 different identities throughout his life, and there may have been others that were never discovered. He had been Larry Vanner in New Hampshire, Bob Evans in California, Curtis Kimball in Texas, and various other names in various other places. In each place, he had established himself as a normal member of the community. He had held jobs. He had made friends. He had married women who believed they knew who he was. And then, inevitably, the mask would slip. The women who became too close to him, who learned too much about who he really was, had a tendency to disappear. The full scope of Rasmussen's crimes may never be known. He operated during an era before widespread DNA databases and internet searches made it harder for serial offenders to move from place to place undetected. He was able to create new identities with relative ease, exploiting gaps in the documentation systems that existed before the digital age. He preyed on vulnerable women and children, choosing victims who were isolated from their families and unlikely to be missed. He was careful, patient, and ruthless. One question that lingered after the identification of Rasmussen was the fate of the girl who had been living with him in Allenstown. This girl, who had been presented as his daughter Lisa, had grown up and moved on to her own adult life. She had been living under a false identity, one that Rasmussen had presumably created for her. She had no idea of her true origins, no knowledge of who her real family was or what had happened to them. Through genetic genealogy, investigators were eventually able to identify this woman as well. Her real name, they discovered, was Dawn Bodon. She was not Rasmussen's biological daughter. She was the daughter of another victim, a woman named Denise Bodin, who had disappeared in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Denise had been in a relationship with Rasmussen, and when she vanished, he had kept her daughter and raised her as his own under a false identity. Dawn had spent her entire childhood not knowing who she really was, living with the man who had almost certainly killed her mother. The discovery of Dawn's true identity was both a resolution and a tragedy. She had spent decades not knowing who she really was, not knowing that her father was not her father, not knowing that her mother had been killed and hidden somewhere by the man who raised her. The revelation of the truth was undoubtedly devastating, but it also provided answers that she had never known to seek. She learned her real name. She learned about her biological family. She learned the terrible truth about the man who had raised her. The Bear Brook case stands as a testament to the power of persistence and the advances that forensic science has made over the past several decades. It demonstrates that cases which seem hopelessly cold can still be solved given enough time and the right technological tools. It also serves as a reminder of the human cost of violence, of the lives that were taken and the families that were destroyed by a man who preyed on the vulnerable. Anyone who follows true crime cases knows that resolution does not always mean justice in the conventional sense. Terry Rasmussen was never convicted of the Bear Brook murders. He was never tried for those specific crimes, never sentenced for the deaths of Marlise Honeychurch and her daughters, never held formally accountable for what he did to that family. He died in prison for the murder of Unsoon June, another of his victims. And whatever punishment he might have faced for the Bear Brook killings was preempted by his death. But there is another kind of justice that comes from identification, from the restoration of names, from the acknowledgement of lives that were lived before they were taken. For more than 30 years, the woman and children in the barrels were anonymous. They were victims without identities, remembered only as cases to be solved, as puzzles to be figured out. The work of investigators and forensic scientists gave them back their names, gave their families the closure of knowing what had happened, and gave the world a chance to remember them as the individuals they had been rather than simply as victims. Marlies Honeychurch was a woman who loved her children and who had the misfortune of becoming involved with a man who would take everything from her. She deserved better than the fate that befell her. She deserved to grow old, to see her daughters grow up to become a grandmother, to experience all the ordinary joys and sorrows that make up a life. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She had a history that extended beyond the barrel, where she was found a life that mattered to the people who knew her. Marie Vaughn and Sarah McWaters were young girls who should have had the chance to grow up, to experience the milestones of adolescence and adulthood, to build lives of their own. Marie should have gone to middle school and high school, should have had crushes and heartbreaks, should have graduated and gone to college or started a career. Sarah should have learned to ride a bicycle, should have made her first best friend, should have had the chance to discover who she was and who she wanted to become. They should have grown into women with their own stories, to tell their own families, to love their own contributions to make to the world. Baby Doe was a child who deserved to have her name known and her life remembered, even if that life was cut short before she could form any memories of it. She existed for such a brief time, but her existence mattered. She was loved by her mother, at least for a little while. She was part of a family. She deserved better than to become a footnote in a criminal investigation, identified only by a placeholder name because her real name was never recorded. These are the people at the center of the Bear Brook case. They are not abstractions or case numbers. They were real human beings with families and futures that were stolen from them. The investigation that brought their identities to light. An acknowledgement that their lives mattered and that their deaths should not be forgotten. The woods of Bear Brook State Park are quiet now. The barrels have long since been removed, and the clearing where they were found has been reclaimed by the forest. Trees have grown where the barrels once sat. Leaves fall each autumn and decompose into the soil, covering any trace of what happened there. There is no marker at the site, no indication to hikers or hunters that something terrible once occurred in that spot. The land has moved on, as land always does, indifferent to the human tragedies that have played out upon it. But the memory of what happened there remains. In the files of the New Hampshire State Police, in the records of the medical examiner's office, and in the minds of the investigators who worked the case for 3 decades, the Bear Brook murders are still present. They are a reminder of the work that remains to be done, of the other cases that are still waiting for the breakthrough that might finally bring them to resolution. They are a reminder that every cold case represents a family waiting for answers, a victim waiting to be named, a story waiting to be told. There are cold cases across the country, cases involving victims who have never been identified and crimes that have never been solved. The Bear Brook case offers hope that some of these mysteries might eventually yield their secrets. The same technologies that identified Marlies Honeychurch and her daughters are being applied to other cases, other victims, other families waiting for answers. Progress is slow, measured in years rather than months, but it is real. The science continues to advance, and investigators continue to push forward, refusing to accept that any case is truly beyond solution. For those who have followed the Bear Brook case over the years, the resolution was both satisfying and bittersweet. It is satisfying to know that the victims have been identified, that their families have some measure of closure, and that the man responsible has been named even if he could not be prosecuted. It is bittersweet to reflect on the lives that were lost, on the children who never got to grow up, on the mother who never got to see her daughters become adults. The satisfaction and the sorrow exist together, inseparable parts of the same story. Some people find it difficult to understand why true crime cases resonate so deeply with so many listeners. There is something about these stories that captures attention and holds it. Something that goes beyond simple curiosity or the desire for entertainment. Perhaps it is the reminder that the world can be dangerous, that there are people who will do terrible things to innocent victims. Perhaps it is the hope that justice can be achieved, that the truth can be discovered, that the darkness can be illuminated by the patient work of investigators who refuse to give up. Perhaps it is simply the human desire to know, to understand. Whatever the reason, cases like Bear Brook continue to draw interest and attention years after they have been resolved. They become part of the larger conversation about crime and justice in America, about the ways we fail to protect the vulnerable and the ways we work to hold wrongdoers accountable. They remind us that behind every case number is a human being, someone with a name and a story, and a life that was cut short. The story of Bear Brook is in many ways a story of waiting. The victims waited in the woods for 15 years before the second barrel was found. The case waited for decades before the technology existed to identify the remains. The families waited, though they did not know they were waiting for the day when they would learn what had happened to their missing relatives. And now, having finally received answers, they must wait for the grief and the healing that follow such revelations. It is a reminder that time moves differently for those who are waiting for answers. A year is nothing to a case file sitting in a box on a shelf, but it is everything to a family member hoping for news of a loved one. The work of cold case investigation is in part an acknowledgement of this disparity, an attempt to honor the waiting by continuing to search even when hope seems unreasonable. The investigators who worked the Bear Brook case understood this. They continued to pursue leads and re-examine evidence, even when there was little reason to believe that progress would be made. They embraced new technologies as they became available, never accepting that the case was truly hopeless. Their persistence was rewarded ultimately by the identification of the victims and the naming of the perpetrator. It was not the kind of dramatic breakthrough that makes headlines on the day it happens, but rather the cumulative result of years of steady, determined work. This kind of work often goes unrecognized and uncelebrated. The detectives and forensic scientists who solve cold cases do not typically receive awards or public acclaim. They work quietly in offices and laboratories, examining evidence and building cases one piece at a time. The satisfaction they receive comes from the work itself, from the knowledge that they have brought answers to families and justice to victims who might otherwise have been forgotten. The Bear Brook case is closed now, at least as closed as any case can be when the perpetrator has died before facing trial. The victims have been identified. The killer has been named. The families have received what closure is possible under the circumstances. The files have been updated to reflect the resolution of the investigation. But the case is not forgotten. It is studied by students of forensic science as an example of how investigative genetic genealogy can be applied to cold cases. It is discussed by podcasters and writers who seek to understand the phenomenon of serial killing and the ways that such criminals evade detection for so long. It is remembered by the community of Allenstown, which has had to grapple with the knowledge that a serial killer once lived in their midst. The houses where Terry Rasmussen stayed during his time in New Hampshire still stand in their neighborhoods. The roads he walked are still traveled by residents going about their daily business. The woods where he hid his victims are still open to the public, still welcoming hunters and hikers who seek the solitude that the park offers. There is nothing visible that marks these places as sites of tragedy. Only the memory remains, carried by those who know the story. It is a strange thing to walk through a place where terrible things have happened, and to find it indistinguishable from any other place. The world does not mark its wounds in ways that are visible to the casual observer. The landscape absorbs the violence and continues on unchanged by the human dramas that have played out upon it. Only through the telling of stories do we keep the memory alive. Do we remind ourselves and each other of what has been lost and what has been found? The story of Bear Brook will continue to be told. It will be shared by those who find value in true crime narratives, who believe that these stories matter and that the victims deserve to be remembered. It will be studied by those who seek to understand how crimes can go unsolved for so long and how they can finally be resolved through the application of new science. And it will be remembered by those who knew the victims, who loved them, and who now have the small comfort of knowing what happened to them. For anyone who has ever wondered whether cold cases can be solved, the Bear Brook case offers an answer that is both cautionary and hopeful. They can be solved. It takes time. It takes resources that are not always available. It takes technological advances that cannot be predicted or controlled. And it takes investigators who are willing to keep working, even when there is no apparent reason for hope. But it can be done. The persistence of those who refuse to give up, combined with the inexorable progress of forensic science, can bring answers to cases that once seemed impossible to solve. This is the promise of cold case investigation. It is not a guarantee that every case will be solved or that every victim will be identified. Some mysteries will remain mysteries. Some questions will remain unanswered. Some families will never receive the closure they deserve. But the promise exists nonetheless. The work continues. New cases are examined with new tools. Old evidence is reanalyzed with fresh perspectives. And somewhere in a file room or a laboratory or a detective's office, the next breakthrough is being prepared. The victims of Bear Brook waited more than 30 years for their names to be spoken again. Marley's Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, Sarah McWaters, and the child known as Baby Doe were forgotten for decades, known only as case numbers and forensic profiles. Now they are remembered. Now their stories can be told. Now their lives can be honored, even if their deaths remain a tragedy that can never be undone. If this story has stayed with you, if it has made you think about the cases that remain unsolved and the victims who remain unnamed, you might consider sharing it with others who might feel the same way. These stories matter. The telling of them matters. And the memory of those who are gone is kept alive by those who choose to remember. If there is a case you believe deserves to be told, a story that deserves to be heard, you are always welcome to share it. The pattern of Terry Rasmussen's life as investigators eventually pieced it together, revealed a man who had made deception his primary mode of existence. From his earliest adult years, he had shown a facility for reinvention that went far beyond the ordinary human capacity for starting over. Most people who change their identities do so for specific reasons: to escape a bad marriage, to flee creditors, to leave behind a troubled past. Rasmussen seemed to do it compulsively, moving from identity to identity, not because any single persona had become untenable, but because reinvention itself had become his way of being in the world. His first documented marriages occurred in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, during an era when verifying someone's identity was far more difficult than it would become in later decades. There were no computerized databases linking records across state lines. Driver's licenses were simple documents that could be obtained with minimal verification. Social security numbers were not yet the universal identifiers they would become. A determined person with modest intelligence could create a new identity with relatively little effort. And Rasmussen was determined, and far from stupid. He married women who were often vulnerable, women who were eager for partnership and perhaps not inclined to ask too many questions about his past. He presented himself as whatever they needed him to be: a steady worker, a caring partner, a responsible father figure. He was attentive in the early stages of relationships, showing the kind of focused interest that can be intoxicating to someone who has not experienced it before. He made women feel seen and valued. He made them trust him. And then, over time, the mask would slip. The attentive partner would become controlling. The caring man would become cruel. The steady presence would become unpredictable and frightening. By the time the women in his life realized who they were really dealing with, they were often isolated from their families and support systems, trapped in situations that seemed to have no good exit. Some of these women survived their entanglements with Rasmussen. They got away, rebuilt their lives, and tried to forget the nightmare they had experienced. Some of them would later come forward to share what they knew with investigators, providing pieces of the puzzle that would eventually reveal the full scope of Rasmussen's predation. Their testimony helped establish the pattern, showed that Rasmussen's behavior was consistent across decades and across state lines. But some of the women in Rasmussen's life did not survive. They disappeared. And for years, no one connected their disappearances to the charming man they had been involved with. They became statistics in a country where thousands of women go missing every year, where the systems designed to track such disappearances are fragmented and incomplete, where a determined predator can operate for decades without detection. The case of Denise Beaudin was particularly significant in understanding how Rasmussen operated. Denise was a young woman from New Hampshire who became involved with Rasmussen in the late 1970s. She had a young daughter named Dawn, and when Denise and Rasmussen began their relationship, to the outside world they appeared to be an ordinary family, a mother, a father figure, and a child living a quiet life in New Hampshire. Then around 1981 or 1982, Denise Beaudin disappeared. She simply stopped existing in the records that document a person's presence in the world. No more employment records, no more government interactions, no more contact with friends or family. She vanished. And because her life had been somewhat unstable, because she had moved frequently and had difficulty maintaining connections, her disappearance went largely unnoticed. Her family eventually reported her missing, but by then the trail had gone cold. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence of what had happened to her. What made Denise's disappearance particularly sinister was what happened to her daughter. Dawn did not disappear along with her mother. Instead, she remained with Rasmussen, who had by then assumed the identity of Larry Vanner. He kept the child, gave her a new name, and raised her as his own daughter. He moved with her from place to place, establishing new identities and new communities, presenting himself as a single father, raising a daughter on his own. Dawn grew up not knowing who she really was. She believed the story Rasmussen told her about her origins, believed that the man raising her was her biological father. She had no memories of her mother, no knowledge of what had happened to her. She was a living victim of Rasmussen's crimes, her identity stolen along with her mother's life. The revelation of Dawn's true identity came decades later, as part of the same genetic genealogy investigation that identified the victims in the barrels. DNA analysis showed that she was not related to Terry Rasmussen at all. She was the biological daughter of Denise Beaudin, a woman who had been missing for more than 30 years. The discovery gave Dawn answers she had never known to seek. But it also confronted her with the terrible truth about the man who had raised her. Denise Bowden's remains have never been found. Unlike the victims in Bear Brook State Park, whose bodies were eventually discovered and identified. Investigators believe she was killed by Rasmussen around the time of her disappearance. But without remains, without evidence, her fate can only be inferred from the circumstantial evidence that points toward murder. She is another victim of Rasmussen's violence, remembered now because of what happened to her daughter, but still waiting for the closure that comes with the recovery and identification of remains. The story of Denise and Dawn illustrates one of the most disturbing aspects of Rasmussen's crimes. He did not just kill his victims. He erased them, eliminating not just their lives but their very identities, their connections to the world, their existence in the minds of those who had known them. He took children from their mothers and raised them under false names, creating a new generation of victims who would carry the trauma of his crimes into their own lives. He was not just a killer, but a kind of identity thief, stealing not just valuables, but the fundamental fact of who his victims were. This pattern of identity theft extended to Rasmussen himself. He was perhaps his own most successful victim, erasing his true self so completely that it took decades of investigation to uncover who he really was. Terry Peter Rasmussen, born in Arizona in 1943, had ceased to exist long before his death in prison in 2010. In his place were a succession of identities, each one real enough to pass scrutiny in the moment, but ultimately hollow. Masks worn by a man who perhaps did not have a true self underneath them all. Some people who study serial killers have noted that many of them share this quality of emptiness, this absence of a coherent identity beneath the personas they present to the world. They are chameleons, adapting to their environments, becoming whatever they need to be to achieve their aims. They lack the stable sense of self that most people take for granted, the continuity of identity that allows us to recognize ourselves in our memories and imagine ourselves in our futures. For such individuals, assuming a new identity may not feel like deception at all. It may simply feel like one more adaptation in a life defined by constant change. This is speculation, of course. Rasmussen never submitted to psychological evaluation while alive, and he left behind no journals or confessions that might illuminate his inner life. What he thought, what he felt, why he did what he did. All of these questions remain unanswered. We can observe the pattern of his behavior, the trail of destruction he left across the country. But we cannot truly understand the mind that produced that pattern. What we can understand is the impact of his crimes on the people whose lives he touched. The women he killed, the children he orphaned, the families he destroyed. All of them bear the weight of his violence. They are the human cost of his existence, the measure of the harm he caused during his decades of predation. The town of Allenstown, New Hampshire, is a small community of fewer than 5,000 people. The kind of place where neighbors know each other's names and newcomers are noticed but not necessarily scrutinized. It is a quiet place. The kind of place where people move to escape the noise and crowding of larger cities. Where families can raise children in relative safety. Where the rhythms of life are slow and predictable. The discovery that a serial killer had once lived among them, had walked their streets and shopped at their stores, and perhaps attended their community events. Small towns have a particular relationship with crime. When something terrible happens in a small town, it is not just a news story that residents read about and forget. It is an event that touches everyone. That becomes part of the shared history of the place. That changes how residents think about their community and themselves. The Bear Brook murders became part of Allenstown's identity, a dark chapter in the town's story that residents would discuss and remember for generations. Some residents remembered Larry Vanner, or the man they had known by that name. They remembered him as quiet, perhaps a bit odd, but not obviously dangerous. He had lived among them, had raised a daughter in their community, had presented a face to the world that gave no indication of what he was capable of. This ordinariness was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the revelation. A monster had lived among them, and they had not known. The realization raised uncomfortable questions about what else they might not know, about what other secrets might be hiding behind the ordinary faces of their neighbors. This is a common experience in communities that have been touched by serial violence. The aftermath of such revelations often includes a period of collective self-examination, a questioning of assumptions about safety and normalcy that had previously gone unexamined. Residents wonder if there were signs they should have seen, warnings they should have heeded. They wonder if they could have done something to prevent the tragedy, if their vigilance might have saved lives. This kind of retrospective guilt is usually unwarranted, since predators like Rasmussen are skilled at concealment. But it is a natural human response to the discovery that evil has been living next door. For the families of the victims, the impact of the Bear Brook case was more direct and more devastating. When Marley's Honeychurch's relatives learned what had happened to her and her daughters, they were confronted with the end of a mystery that had haunted them for decades. Marley's had disappeared in the early 1982s, and her family had never known what happened to her. They had wondered, hoped, and eventually despaired as the years passed without any word. The revelation of her fate brought closure, but it also brought the terrible confirmation of their worst fears. Their daughter, their sister, their aunt. They had died violently and been hidden in the woods like refuse. It was not the ending anyone had hoped for. The process of grieving for someone who has been missing for decades is complicated and painful. When a person disappears, their loved ones are left in a state of suspended mourning, unable to move forward with the grieving process because they do not know whether the missing person is dead or alive. They may hold on to hope for years, imagining scenarios in which their loved one is still alive somewhere, living a new life, perhaps unable or unwilling to make contact. The revelation of death ends this hope, but also allows the grieving process to finally begin. It is a relief and a devastation at the same time. For the family members of the Bear Brook victims, the decades of uncertainty were finally over. They could grieve for their losses, could hold memorial services, could begin the long process of coming to terms with what had happened. But they also had to integrate the new information into their understanding of their loved ones' lives. Marley's had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered by a man she had trusted. Her children had been killed alongside her. The family had to grapple not just with loss, but with the particular horror of violent death, with the knowledge that their loved ones had suffered. The case also had an impact on the broader community of people who follow true crime cases. The Bear Brook murders became one of the most discussed and analyzed cold cases of the modern era, studied for its investigative techniques and its use of genetic genealogy, debated for its implications about identity and deception. Podcasts were made about the case, books were written, documentaries were produced. The victims, who had been anonymous for so long, became known to millions of people who had never met them. Their stories told and retold in the ongoing conversation about crime and justice in America. This attention served a purpose beyond entertainment or education. It kept the memory of the victims alive, ensured that their deaths would not be forgotten, and demonstrated the power of public attention to bring resources and focus to cold cases that might otherwise languish unsolved. The Bear Brook case became a model for other investigations, showing what was possible when traditional investigative techniques were combined with new forensic technologies. It inspired other cold case investigators to revisit their own unsolved murders, to submit DNA samples to genetic genealogy databases, to pursue leads that had previously seemed hopeless. The legacy of the Bear Brook case is thus both tragic and hopeful. It is tragic because it reminds us of the terrible things that human beings can do to each other, of the lives cut short by violence, of the families destroyed by cruelty. But it is hopeful because it shows that even the coldest cases can be solved, that even the most anonymous victims can be identified, that the truth can emerge even after decades of silence. It is a reminder that persistence matters, that the passage of time does not necessarily mean that justice is impossible. The investigators who worked the Bear Brook case for more than 30 years embodied this persistence. They were not deterred by the lack of immediate results, by the frustration of leads that went nowhere, by the years that passed without apparent progress. They continued to believe that the case could be solved, continued to apply new techniques as they became available, continued to hope that someday the victims would have their names and their families would have answers. Their faith was eventually rewarded, but the reward was not the point. The work itself was the point. The ongoing commitment to truth and justice that defines the best of what law enforcement can be. As the years continue to pass and the Bear Brook case recedes into history, there are still cold cases waiting to be solved, still victims waiting to be identified, still families waiting for answers. The techniques that broke the Bear Brook case are being applied to these other mysteries, and slowly, case by case, the backlog of unsolved crimes is being reduced. The work continues because it must, because every victim deserves to be known, because every family deserves the truth. The woods of Bear Brook State Park still stand, still welcoming visitors who come to hike and hunt and experience the beauty of the New Hampshire wilderness. The clearings where the barrels were found have long since been reclaimed by the forest, indistinguishable from any other patch of woodland. Life goes on as it always does, indifferent to the tragedies that have occurred in particular places. But the memory persists, kept alive by those who know the story and choose to remember. It is a small thing perhaps, but it matters. The dead deserve to be remembered, and the living have a responsibility to remember them. The nature of cold case investigation has changed dramatically since the Bear Brook murders first came to light in 1985. In those early days, investigators were limited by the technology and techniques of their era. They could examine physical evidence, interview witnesses, and compare dental records against known missing persons. But beyond these traditional methods, they had few tools at their disposal. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Databases were fragmented and incomplete, and the concept of investigative genetic genealogy would not exist for another 3 decades. Today, the landscape is vastly different. DNA can be extracted from the smallest traces of biological material, even material that has degraded over years or decades of exposure to the elements. Databases contain genetic profiles from millions of individuals, many of whom submitted their DNA for genealogical research without ever imagining that their genetic information might help solve crimes. Sophisticated software can trace family trees through generations of records, connecting distant relatives through shared genetic markers. The tools that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators of 1985 are now standard equipment in modern forensic laboratories. This technological revolution has transformed what is possible in cold case investigation. Cases that seemed hopeless for decades are now being solved at an unprecedented rate. The unidentified dead are being given names. Killers who thought they had escaped justice are being identified and, when still alive, prosecuted. The backlog of unsolved cases, while still substantial, is slowly being reduced as new techniques are applied to old evidence. But technology alone cannot solve cold cases. Behind every breakthrough is human effort. The patient work of investigators who review old files, retest evidence, and pursue leads that others have abandoned. The machines and algorithms that process DNA samples are powerful tools, but they require human operators who understand their capabilities and limitations. The family trees that connect distant relatives to unidentified victims are traced by genealogists who spend hours poring over records, building connections from fragments of information. The prosecutions that result from cold case breakthroughs are built by lawyers and detectives who assemble evidence into coherent narratives of criminal behavior. The Bear Brook case exemplifies this combination of technology and human persistence. The DNA analysis that identified the victims was cutting-edge science, the product of decades of research and development in molecular biology and genetics. But the decision to apply that technology to this particular case was made by humans who had never given up on solving the mystery. The genetic genealogy that connected the DNA profiles to specific individuals required hours of painstaking research by specialists who understood both the science and the historical records that documented family relationships. The investigation that identified Terry Rasmussen as the perpetrator combined forensic evidence with traditional detective work, building a case from fragments of information scattered across decades and state lines. The human element is crucial because it provides the motivation that machines cannot. Machines do not care whether cold cases are solved. They process data according to their programming, producing results without any understanding of what those results mean. Only humans can appreciate the significance of identifying an unknown victim, of giving a name to someone who has been anonymous for decades. Only humans can feel the weight of responsibility that comes with seeking justice for the dead. Only humans can understand why the work matters. This human dimension is often overlooked in discussions of forensic technology. News coverage tends to focus on the technical aspects of breakthroughs, on the sophistication of DNA analysis, or the power of genetic genealogy databases. But behind every technical achievement are people who chose to devote their professional lives to solving crimes that others had given up on. These are the unsung heroes of cold case investigation, the detectives and scientists and analysts who keep working when there is no immediate prospect of success, who believe that persistence will eventually be rewarded. The families of cold case victims are also part of this human dimension. They are the ones who wait, sometimes for decades, for news of their missing loved ones. They are the ones who never stop hoping, never stop wondering, never stop believing that someday they will know what happened. When breakthroughs occur, they are the ones who must integrate the new information into lives that have been shaped by uncertainty and loss. Their grief is both ended and renewed by the revelations that solve cold cases. As the hope of finding their loved ones alive gives way to the certainty of death, the Bear Brook case touched many such families. The relatives of Marlise Honeychurch had wondered for decades what had happened to her. The family of Denise Baudin had searched for years for any trace of the woman who had vanished. Dawn Baudin, who had lived her entire life not knowing who she really was, had to come to terms with the revelation that her identity had been stolen along with her mother's life. Each of these individuals experienced the resolution of the case differently, but all of them were changed by the knowledge of what had happened. The broader public also has a relationship with cold cases, one that has grown more intimate in the era of true crime media. Podcasts, documentaries, and books have brought the details of unsolved crimes into millions of homes, creating communities of amateur investigators and interested observers who follow cases with the attention that was once reserved for sports teams or television shows. This public engagement can be beneficial, bringing attention and resources to cases that might otherwise languish in obscurity. It can also be problematic, as armchair detectives sometimes interfere with ongoing investigations or harass innocent individuals who have been named as suspects. The Bear Brook case has benefited from public attention in ways that are mostly positive. The podcast that told the story of the case brought widespread awareness to the investigation and highlighted the potential of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. The public interest generated by the podcast may have helped secure resources for the investigation and contributed to the momentum that eventually led to the identification of the victims and the perpetrator. The story of Bear Brook has also educated the public about the reality of serial violence and the challenges of investigating crimes that span decades. As we reflect on what the Bear Brook case means, it is worth considering what it tells us about the nature of justice. Terry Rasmussen was never tried for the murders he committed in New Hampshire. He died in prison while serving time for a different crime, and whatever punishment he might have faced for the Bear Brook killings was preempted by his death. In a conventional sense, justice was not served. The legal system never had the opportunity to hold him accountable for these specific crimes, to sentence him for these specific murders, to provide the formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing that trials are meant to produce. But justice is not solely a matter of legal proceedings. It is also a matter of truth, of acknowledgement, of memory. The identification of the Bear Brook victims restored their names and their stories to the historical record. The identification of Rasmussen as their killer established the truth about what happened and who was responsible. The public attention given to the case ensured that the victims would not be forgotten, that their lives and deaths would be remembered and honored. This is a form of justice that exists outside the courtroom, a vindication that comes from truth rather than from legal proceedings. The families of the victims have received what closure is possible under the circumstances. They know what happened to their loved ones. They can grieve for their losses with the certainty that comes from knowledge. They can visit graves and hold memorial services and remember the dead as individuals rather than as mysteries. This is not the same as watching a killer be sentenced to prison, but it is something. It is more than they had during the decades when the victims remained unidentified and the case remained unsolved. For the investigators who worked the Bear Brook case, the resolution brought a different kind of satisfaction. They had solved a case that many had thought was unsolvable. They had applied new techniques to old evidence and achieved results that vindicated their years of effort. They had given names to the nameless and answers to the questioning. This professional satisfaction is its own form of justice. The recognition that patient work can produce results even when those results take decades to achieve. The lessons of the Bear Brook case extend beyond this particular investigation. They apply to cold cases everywhere, to the thousands of unsolved crimes that wait in file rooms and evidence lockers across the country. Each of these cases represents a victim who deserves to be known, a family that deserves answers, a story that deserves to be told. The technology that solved Bear Brook can be applied to these other cases, and in many instances, it is being applied. Slowly but steadily, the backlog of cold cases is being reduced one identification at a time. This is the hopeful legacy of the Bear Brook case. It demonstrated that even the coldest cases can be solved, that even the most anonymous victims can be identified, that the passage of decades does not necessarily mean that justice is impossible. It showed that persistence and technology can combine to achieve results that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations of investigators. It proved that the dead are not forgotten, that their stories can be recovered from the silence of unmarked graves and unidentified remains. The victims of Bear Brook waited more than 30 years for their names to be spoken again. Marley's Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, Sarah McWaters, and the child known as Baby Doe are no longer anonymous. Their stories can now be told. Their lives can now be honored. Their memories can now be preserved. They are remembered. And in being remembered, they are given a form of immortality that death cannot take away. If this story has resonated with you, if it has made you think about the importance of persistence and truth and memory, then perhaps it has served its purpose. These stories matter because the people at the center of them matter. The telling of them keeps alive the memory of those who have been lost. And the memory of the lost is our responsibility, a debt we owe to those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. If there is a case you believe deserves attention, a story you believe deserves to be told, your voice matters in keeping these memories alive.